Magalhaes to Stokes, who's onside. 1-0.
Here's Sims. It's a good search this from Southampton. They could finish the job here. It's Shane Long, and he has done it. Just a minute to play. That's stoppage time. Here's Letizia. Who better to say farewell than one of the finest players ever to wear the red and white.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 82 of the Saints FC podcast. This week, I'm delighted to have back on the show, you may remember him from a couple of seasons ago, we have Mr. Duncan Alexander from Opta. Welcome, Duncan. Welcome back to the Saints FC podcast. How are you? How's the last 2 years been?
Yeah, good. I can't immediately imagine 2 years as a solid, quick block like that. But yeah, it's been pretty good, yeah. And thanks for having me back.
Yeah, you're welcome. I think last time we had you on the podcast, we were talking about your book, Outside the Box, a statistical journey through the history of football. I've had a few kind of listeners write in closer to 2 years ago when we did the episode, saying that they kind of read that and enjoyed it. I think most people probably, if they're into football and they're into podcasts, will recognise your voice from as being a regular pundit on the Totally Football show, where I kind of like how your quipping of kind of statistics and dry wit seems to... I don't know if it seems like that when you're in the studio with him, but audio-wise, you seem to have James Richardson perplexed regularly and kind of almost as there's like an audio moment of confusion. Do you see possibly that when he's looking back at you?
Yeah, sometimes he does look a bit baffled by what I've said or a reference I've made. But then, he's very good at referencing older stuff. So I think we both, have interests outside football as well, which is quite useful when you can't always just completely reference stuff around what's happened. So that's, yeah. But yeah, it's always really enjoyable doing the show. And obviously I've got a certain niche, but, people seem to enjoy that. So that's good.
Yeah. And so I noticed on your Twitter account, which is @OilySailor, I don't know if we'll ever find out why you're called Oily Sailor or not, but you call yourself luxury sports content. I quite like that. Other than producing luxury sports content, what is your day job at Opta? How can we describe that to our listeners? What do you actually do?
So various things, really. I mean, I guess what separates Opta from some of our competitors is that we've always had teams of people who go through the data. We don't just produce data, we also produce stuff from the data. So for instance, like last night, Monday Night Football, a lot of the pre-match content or even post-match, looking at how the game went, you'd have seen stuff around Chelsea's XG and things like that. That's all produced by our data editorial team. So I used to be very closely involved with the UK branch of that. Last few years, I do kind of more, ad hoc stuff. So that can be things like podcasts. I do stuff on the Premier League TV channel, which is sort of shown around the world, less so in the UK. And then various other things. We do a lot of work with brands as well. So, for instance, Nissan and the Champions League sponsor, and they, if they've got like a data angle to that. So it's coming up with stories that sort of fit in with, how they want to work with the Champions League and teams and players in that. So yeah, it's pretty varied, really. It's kind of any application of data, football data into the real world, I guess. And I guess it's sort of translating the data into something a bit more palatable for the general fan. I'm not a person with a statistical or maths background, but over the years I've kind of got into sports statistics, but I still try and do it in a way that is understandable for the normal fan, because that's essentially what I am as well. So, even with the last few years with new models like expected goals, expected assists, sequences, carries, things like that, you still have to find a story that people are going to understand and kind of engage with. Otherwise, if you just throw a load of numbers at them or a load of concepts, it doesn't matter if they're a fan or even a coach or a manager or a chairman at a club, they're still just going to be a bit turned off because it just sounds a bit matty.
Yeah, I try and kind of dread to try and think about the amount of times I've tried to explain what XG is to various kind of family members and other football fans, and probably to the listeners a few too many times as well. But there's an amazing angle that I think that you bring to the statistical stuff, and it's funny about you saying how you weren't a maths geek. I remember my interest in maths was pretty much always from football statistics through to school, which didn't quite carry me to completing my maths A level. But anyway, I digress. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about. We're discussing just before we were recording that I've moved down to Devon, and I now work in Plymouth. And in Plymouth, there's a very big military presence. And I was invited for dinner with a guy called Captain Richard Harris at HMS Raleigh, which is like one of the big military bases there. And also at this dinner was the managing director of Plymouth Argyle Football Club. And we ended up having a little bit of a discussion about the use of kind of statistics and analytics in football. And he was hoping to kind of do a bit more at Plymouth Argyle, because they're down in League Two now, than perhaps their peers are doing in League Two and League One, and steal a bit of a march. And he mentioned Opta. So, what do you guys actually do for the teams themselves? Is that where you're kind of like crunching the numbers into some sort of meaningful data, or do they ask you for like specific things and then crunch that data themselves?
It depends on the club and the size of club, really. So we have a specific division called Opta Pro, which is obviously works with professional clubs. We probably work with 300-400 clubs around the globe. Now, if it's Manchester City or Chelsea, who we've worked with, both of them for a long time, probably our longest standing kind of big clubs in inverted commas, they will just take reams and reams of data and then disappear into a locked room with lots of their own employees and do what they do with it. Whereas a club like Plymouth will, obviously doesn't have the resources of a Chelsea or Manchester City, so they tend to buy or use a kind of more off the peg solution. So we have kind of almost like different solutions for different size clubs, really. So and we're the official data suppliers for the Premier League and Football League. So what that means is that the official data for League One, League Two is provided by us, and we also sell additional services on top of that. For League One and League Two, it's only since the start of last season that we've collected it at the same, or analysed it at the same level that we do for the Premier League and Champions League and stuff. So, for instance, when Saints were down in League One, however many years ago, we wouldn't have had things like pass completion or any kind of even fairly basic stuff like tackles and stuff like that. But now that is all available, and all the other stuff as well, like expected goals. So it's been quite interesting to look at the differences between, say, the Premier League and the lower leagues in England. I mean, I'm a Wycombe fan, and we're probably one of the biggest outliers statistically in terms of style of play compared to the Premier League. So that Wycombe will frequently record pass completion rates of sort of 53, 54, 55%, which is the Premier League average is around 80. So that's a fairly big difference.
Are Wycombe the Burnley of the lower leagues then? Is that
kind of? I mean,
is that too simpler?
I mean, in a sense they are, because what Burnley have managed to do, which no one has really figured out, is break a lot of statistical models, in the sense of this couple of years ago when Burnley came 7th, they only scored 40 goals in 38 games, and they managed to come 7th. And they, looking at all the numbers, they should have not been that high, but they managed to do it. So they're obviously doing something right. And and Wycombe probably are similar this season. Obviously, we've been in the top 2 for most of the season with one of the smallest budgets in the league. So Yeah, that kind of proves the point in the sense that if football was as simple as you could crunch a few numbers and work out what was happening, then it wouldn't be a very good game because you could kind of solve it pretty quickly. And I guess what's great about football and what keeps people coming back and what makes it the most popular sport in the world is it is so unpredictable. And such a low scoring game, occasionally you get the odd 9-0, as I'm sure you realise. But
thanks for bringing that up.
sorry. But generally, as a low scoring game, you can be massively dominant in a match and lose 1-0 or 2-1 or something. So, it is a lot more unpredictable than most sports, which I think adds to its appeal.
And can I ask some really simplistic questions here? Because So when you're kind of doing this statistical analysis of teams and particularly the lower leagues, do you have lots of people watching them, or do people just watch the tapes and then kind of generate? I mean, I'm saying tapes, watching the files and then kind of generating that, or do you have kind of heart rate monitors, GPS chips in shirts, or anything like that? I mean, it kind of baffles me that there's so much resource going into looking at that to generate the statistics.
So it's kind of weird. So as official data suppliers, we'll have people at every game purely to collect stuff, getting the referees' reports and things like that. And obviously, if all the technology does fall over, you can at least record the goals at the match. So, your Soccer Saturday video printer will still exist because someone can say, Danny Ings has scored after 23 minutes or whatever. But all the kind of deep analysis is done off video files at various kind of collection hubs around the world we have. And, it's kind of a mixture of computers and humans, really. It takes sort of two and a half people per game, half a person, because a QA person will kind of monitor more than one match. But yeah, basically, someone will log all the home team events and someone will log all the away team events. And there's about 2,000 events per match. So these guys, it takes a lot of training. Most of the people who apply don't get to do it, and the ones that do, take a lot of training before they kind of released into the wild. And that kind of raw data is the most valuable thing, really, because once you've got that, you can't do all the other stuff without that raw data. So it is very kind of, costly and it is a huge kind of undertaking, but it is the kind of bedrock of everything we do.
Wow. I mean, that's amazing. So if there's someone listening to this podcast who's perhaps a maths or a computer science student, or is just amazing at reading the game, how would they get a job at Opta? Do you guys advertise, or do they just send in their CV and go, I reckon I've got a knack for this, come and give me a try?
Well, it depends on what they want to do, in a sense, because if it was just the kind of analysis of the games, that's often that has been just kind of students doing it in weekends and stuff. And although I think our collection hubs are mainly sort of, we've got one in Leeds, we've got one in Portugal, we've got one in South America and a few places. So I mean, the other side of that is obviously if they are into kind of maths and data science and coding and things like that, is there are increasing opportunities for those sort of things, both with companies like Opta, who I should point out, we're now part of a bigger company called Saintsfcpodcast, who are a combination of a company called Stats, who are the biggest data suppliers in the US, and then Perform, who bought Opta a few years ago. Opta, obviously the biggest European data company, so they've brought these two companies together. So that's kind of an even bigger organisation now. But yeah, I mean, what I would say really is to kind of develop your own kind of niche, or at least have kind of social media presence or a blog or that sort of thing. A lot of the people that have come to work for us in the last few years have done so via kind of creating good work out, as amateurs, really, and showing their kind of, showing their understanding of football and their kind of creativity as well. So that's what I would advise, really, is to develop your kind of skills and ability that way, really.
Oh, that's fascinating stuff. So many different ways into football. I was going to kind of save all this for the end, but I just kind of got a bit sidelined there, and wanted to kind of keep on asking you questions there. So I mean, I guess before we get into the main of the podcast and a few more questions I want to ask you. And I am afraid that we're going to have to speak about the Saints Burnley game because we haven't done a Saints FC podcast since that match. Did you manage to watch the highlights or any of this game, Duncan?
I watched the first 10 minutes live, and then my son wanted to play FIFA, so I was usurped from that, and then I watched the highlights. So I mean, obviously I enjoyed the direct from a corner goal as a fan of niche events. And looping back to Wickham, actually, this season I was at game. We beat Lincoln 3-1, and our left back Joe Jacobson scored a hat trick, which is rare for a defender to score a hat trick. Never happened in the Premier League. And two of them were direct from corners, and the other one was a direct free kick. And that will never be done again. I think
that is a pretty niche hat trick. So how niche is a direct goal from the corner in the Premier League?
Well, Westwood scored one for Burnley at Anfield last season, again around this time of year in a kind of windy time of the season. So he's obviously a little bit of a specialist, but yeah, I mean, it was not great defending from Southampton, but those sort of goals are freaks, really.
Can you put down Storm Dennis for an assist, or is that?
Well, I did actually tweet out a list of assists by Dennis in Premier League history with Bergkamp at the top, and Storm Dennis as a new entry. So he's a few behind Dennis Romero, I think. But I think given the way they name Storms, it's going to be quite a long time before there's another Storm Dennis. So
yeah. So it could be a little while before he shows his face again. I mean, I was also going to pin some blame, I think, on Danny Ings and Alex McCarthy for that as well. And it's kind of one of those things. I think if you concede a direct corner within the first 2 minutes, you get a bit of a sense that the game might not be going your way. Although Ings's equaliser, which I've put down in my notes as a lovely bit of business, gave me some hope. I think that was our only shot on target in the whole game, which I think kind of it makes sense. And Burnley, they got the winner eventually through Vidra, but that's 7 games in a row that we've not beaten Burnley. And people talk about kind of like bogey teams. Like Burnley seem to be the team that we really, really struggle with. And I've got a few theories on this, particularly like our incredibly immobile defence and their use of long balls is not helpful for us. But I wonder if you know why we're so dreadful against Burnley in particular.
Well, I think in some senses, as I touched on a little bit earlier, Burnley are a very unusual team. And the way they play is not typical of pretty much every other team in the Premier League. And I think Southampton are actually quite good at facing teams like, let's say, Arsenal or Man City or some of the bigger teams, because you are very good at pressing, but I don't think that works against Burnley because how can you press a team that's just kind of bypassing most of the pitch? So I think that might explain why. And in a weird kind of non-scientific way, you do get teams that have issues against other teams, and it's Chelsea-Tottenham this weekend. And obviously, remember Spurs didn't beat Chelsea for the first 32 encounters in the Premier League. It took them until 2006 before they beat them either home or away. Now, it's not like Chelsea were particularly good for a lot of that period. They obviously were towards the end, but certain clubs do get into certain kind of spirals against certain other teams. So that could be the slight issue with Burnley for Saints. But I mean, it's a bit of a shame really that you lost because the way it's tightening up in the top 8 at the moment is, it sounds ridiculous, but you've got like an outside chance of Champions League football.
Yeah, I mean, this was definitely one of the things that I was going to bring up. So a couple of weeks ago, you tweeted that Saints would qualify for the Champions League and deserve it. Having heard you and met you in person, I imagine this kind of came with a little bit of a pinch of salt and a slight kind of sarcastic tone to it. But there's clearly some evidence base for this because that is kind of what you do. So did you really mean this, Duncan?
Well, I didn't have any preview as to what was going to happen with UEFA and Manchester City, but obviously now assuming that 5th place will get you Champions League, it really is up for grabs. I mean, particularly for someone like Sheffield United, I think. But no, I just think looking at the numbers this season, I've been making the case in various places, and podcasts and stuff, that Southampton are, they're unlucky. And I think that Leicester game did kind of just, people who don't watch many Southampton games, or who just glance at the league table every week or so, will have looked at Saints and gone, well, they're just struggling. But all the numbers suggested that you should be a lot higher, as they have in previous campaigns at various points. So, it wouldn't surprise me if you go on a bit of a run over the next month or two. I think definitely kind of top 8 is within grasp, and I think if you do that, it won't be undeserved. And actually, looking, I promise this will be the last time I mention the 9-0, but if you think it's only happened 3 times in Premier League history. Obviously, Ipswich went down because they really were rubbish back in the mid-90s, but Wigan did it at Tottenham, and they didn't go down that season. It's teams can get thrashed, and it doesn't in one match. It doesn't say everything about the whole season. So, and in many ways, that game and then the Everton home game, I think, were such a wake-up call for Hasenhüttl that you really did kind of change your approach after those games, and obviously that's led to the run that's at least pushed you relatively clear of relegation problems.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you bring up the Everton game because I spent the weekend at a birthday party, speaking to friends who support various football clubs, like Norwich and Liverpool, and from their kind of outsider's perspective of Southampton, they kind of see a 9-0. I mean, the Norwich fan in particular saying he saw the 9-0 and thought, great, that's one less relegation place that I have to worry about. Southampton are guaranteed to go down. They're just dreadful. And they think it's all like, oh, it's just Danny Ings. They must be dreadful. But then it's just Danny Ings who's saving them. And you try and explain people, there's a bit more nuance to that. And obviously that's the point where their eyes glaze over because they're not anywhere near as interested in Southampton Football Club as I am. But it has been a weird season, and that Everton game, I think, for many people there was probably just as bad as the Leicester game, because we conceded, I think, nearly exactly the same number of chances to Everton as we did for Leicester, and that was after it had all happened. You expected us to be picking up as well at that point, and really it seemed the turning point was more the international break, and then I suppose the away game against Arsenal, where we felt like we really should have won that one.
I mean, since November the 23rd, if you did a Premier League table since then, Southampton would be 5th, only 3 points behind Man City, which obviously City aren't having the greatest season, but that's pretty impressive, really. I mean, obviously this, the caveat to that, as people will often point out on social media whenever you do something like this, is but the season doesn't start on November the 23rd. But it is, as I would say, it's essentially a form table of your choosing. So there you go. But you've lost 13 points from winning positions this season. Again, it's just it could be much better. Obviously, it could be worse. But I think there's definite grounds for optimism. And I guess the flip side to that is that Ings is obviously having a standout season, and he on XG and things like that, he is kind of probably overperforming. He's profited, I think, from more errors by defenders and goalkeepers than any other striker in the Premier League this season, which isn't something you can guarantee every year, but it does show how clinical he is. And I think he's obviously been a player that's impressed various managers at bigger clubs. So I think he's obviously talented. It's just, he needed a kind of injury-free run, which he's had this season relatively. So, he might not do as well maybe next season, but I think generally there's signs for optimism. And I guess, given where you were in the autumn, mid-table will probably be acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, given where we were in the autumn, I think most people would have bit your hand off for mid-table. So, I mean, you mentioned just a little bit earlier that you saw things in Southampton in terms of the statistics and the numbers that they were producing that told you that we wouldn't end up in the relegation zone. So what were you looking at there?
So we've got a thing called sequences. So this is a relatively new metric, but it's based on data we've had for a long time. It's just what we've done is kind of linked it together into a bigger kind of metric. So rather than just have a pass, then a shot, or however many, however long you want to go, you can kind of connect stuff into sequences. So you can see, it allows you to look at various other things. So you can look at things like teams that win the ball back high up the pitch and then what they do with it. So if you take that as a concept, so winning the ball high up the pitch, which is obviously the aim of pressing. We've seen it with all the top teams in the last sort of 5-6 years. Now, if you turn in terms of kind of raw numbers of high turnovers, so winning the ball back high up the pitch, Southampton are third this season, behind Liverpool, who are first, and Manchester City, who are second. Now, you'd expect those two to be top. So basically, Saints are best of the rest in that, which is really good. But it's not just winning the ball back, then what they do with it as well. So they've had 28 shots after winning the ball back high up the pitch. So they're not just winning the ball back, they're then turning that possession they've regained into an attacking move. And they've done that 28 times. Again, the only teams to have done that more are City and Liverpool. And then if you go one stage further, which is looking at winning the ball back high up the pitch and then scoring, so obviously turning those shots into goals, Saints have done that 5 times, which is more than any other team. So that really is testament to the work rate of the players, the coaching, and the kind of philosophy. So that immediately isn't the sign of a team that is kind of really struggling to create, and also a team that often what you find with struggling teams is that they kind of give up a bit. We saw Everton under Marco Silva towards the end. We've seen in previous seasons in the Premier League where clubs have really kind of gone into a bit of a tailspin. All those kind of metrics disappear because no one wants to press the opposition, and that really isn't the case with Saints. And the other end of the pitch as well, there's a thing called PPDA, which is passes per defensive action. So all that means is on average, how many passes does the opposition have per number of defensive actions that your own team does? Obviously, that can be a tackle or an interception or whatever. But so the lower the figure, basically the kind of harder the press, or the more intense the defending, if you like. So on that metric, again, Southampton are in the top 3. The best team for that are Leicester. And then City are second. So, and then Liverpool are 5th, actually. Chelsea are 4th. So Saints again really high up in this metric, and these are all metrics that it's not like if you do well in these metrics you're automatically going to be good. But it's if you're doing well in these metrics, then there's things are working to a certain extent, and it's if you're this committed to your play, then you're not going to lose every week, because that's not the way football works. So, yeah, I mean, it always looked to me, Watford as well, to a certain extent, both Watford and Southampton's underlying numbers were far better than their league position suggested. And I guess, Watford had that bounce under Pearson, which has sort of tailed off a little bit. But even so, I think what I would still say Watford have got a reasonable chance of getting out of trouble.
Yeah. It's quite interesting you're saying about winning the ball high up the pitch and creating 28 chances and then 5 of those being goals, because I think when you go and watch Southampton in the stadium, you can see really evidently that that's what they're trying to do. And in a way, I'd have almost expected that to be a bit more fruitful, because it seems like such a big part of the game is winning that ball high up the pitch and then getting the goal. But basically, I suppose kind of what you're saying is that there's enough metrics that were all looking positive for Southampton that told you that they're doing lots of things right in different parts of the pitch that should end up resulting in games being won.
Yeah, and I think in some respects, I mean, obviously Hasenhüttl gets a bit of the kind of Alpine Klopp moniker from time to time, and in some, I would say Southampton's numbers this season kind of reminiscent of Klopp's first, what was it, three-quarter season at Liverpool, where he came in and very much was kind of gegenpressing and all that stuff, and Liverpool obviously refined that a lot over the last few years, and they struggled. They were quite inconsistent that season, because if it worked, it worked approach. bear dividends. And then sometimes, Burnley will just kind of outwit you. And, I guess that's the difference between a team in mid-table and a team that's 25 points clear at the top, is that, Liverpool have kind of, they've gone into such depth on. I saw this week someone else, Tim Sherwood, having a go at the fact Liverpool have a throw-in coach, as if it was a kind of an offensive thing to the art of coaching, that they would be this, go into this much depth. But it's they've taken it to the next level really in terms of analysis and stuff like that. So there's hope for other clubs if they kind of double down on that approach, I think.
Yeah. That one is an interesting one. That actually, the chap I mentioned earlier, he's the managing director at Plymouth Argyle now. He'd come from Liverpool, and he said that when he was there, they appointed, I can't remember if it was like an astrophysicist or some. Yeah, there's some kind of like scientific position where they'd appointed some guy from a university, and it just seems like I know you're a big fan of cycling, but this is kind of exactly how British cycling did so well. There's some question marks about maybe some use of chemicals also helping marginal gains. But this is the whole theory behind Dave Brailsford and why it's so successful with British cycling, is he looked at every single little thing and, can we get 1% improvement there? Can we get 3% there? Can we get 4% there? And then you put it all together and it gives you enough to beat the opposition. And by the sounds of things, it sounds like Liverpool are doing that in football now. To a greater extent than anyone else.
Yeah, they really are, kind of world leaders now. If you think, I saw someone tweet earlier today that it's like 10 years since the Hicks and Gillette stuff at Liverpool, when they really were possibly the worst run club in the Premier League. So it shows how with careful planning, you can kind of turn it around in a decade. But yeah, that whole astrophysicist stuff, that will be a guy that really understands, the use of space in terms of physics and stuff like that. Now, what Liverpool are also really good at is they will have people that then take his learnings and his research and translate it into stuff that the coaching staff will understand. And I think this is where analytics has made a big leap forward in the last 5 or 6 years, is that when it first came out, that astrophysics guy would talk to the manager, and the manager, like me or you would be as well, would be like, whoa, what's this? I haven't got a PhD in physics, so I don't know what you're on about. But what they do now really well is that they'll give it to someone else who'll say, right, let's boil this down to 3 or 4 learnings, and then give that to the manager, and then he can apply that to the training. And I think that kind of process is at clubs where this whole thing works well. That tends to be the process.
Yeah. And so, you've been talking about what the PPDA and sequences, and I suppose probably the thing that's I've noticed from the statistical world the most, and actually what I find probably is the most useful indicator of performance, is XG. Is it going to be sequences? Are they going to be the next big thing that will be out there for public consumption to understand? Or, have you found people kind of getting a grasp of these different statistical models? Because still XG seems to confuse some people, though for me it's like, well, that makes so much more sense than you like saying you've had 20 shots but they're all from the halfway line. You had 5 really good ones.
I know. I think, as I probably said the last time I was on, actually, I think if we had a time machine, I probably wouldn't call it expected goals, because I think that's probably caused more confusion than anything else, because people hear expected and they think it's the kind of predictive thing, when actually if it had been called or shot quality or something, then I think people would have got their head around it a bit more. People will often say, I think the most common misconception with XG now is someone will say, but if Danny Ings is having a shot, he's really good at finishing, and if insert rubbish person at shooting, if he's having a shot, he's worse. So how can you have a model that has an expectation? It's like, well, because all XG is an average of how a team or a player has done historically, based on all the shots in our database. So there might be 500,000 shots from in that, and there might be 10,000 from this scenario, from this point on the penalty box with this game scenario, blah blah blah. Now, Danny Ings or Lionel Messi or whoever might consistently be above the expected goals, but that's because they are good finishers.
Yeah.
And that's what I think people think there's an individual kind of figure for each player or team, and that, all you're doing is comparing them against the average, really.
And do you think that is the most kind of useful? Because I think it's understat, they're probably rivals of yours, but they put out a Premier League table with all the expected goals, and then they have a table which shows you where would every team be if they actually scored the expected goals or conceded the expected conceded. And I find that tends to be quite a good indicator of form. Although having looked at it, I've looked at Southampton, they've got that going back for 6 seasons, and Southampton consistently finished lower in the league than where they should do based on expected goals. The one exception being the 16-17 and 15-16 seasons where we finished 8th and 6th, and that was about right.
Yeah, so Southampton are kind of a very strange team from this respect, in that, any team can have a season or a bit of a season where they underperform or overperform. But Saints have kind of they've kind of lived the same season, apart from the ones you mentioned, but varied a little bit. But they do have this kind of consistent underperformance, particularly at home as well, which is obviously is reflected in, I guess, in your home record. I think that's quite important as well, because I think, if you support a team who's really good at home and not that good away, fans are a little bit more accepting, because the fans that go to the game are like generally entertained at home. But if it's the other way around, it can be quite hard to leverage that as an approach. And I think, for whatever reason, Southampton have consistently underperformed. Now, I guess you could argue that you had forwards of the quality of Sadio Mane and had to sell them and stuff. But I think, you're probably only a transfer or two away from having a really good season next season. So, and this is where it links back, I guess, to recruitment, which again, data is now a massive part of, and, kind of being ahead of the curve and finding those players, finding the next Sadio Mane, who's going to make a really, big impact, even if he does get moved on after a couple of years.
Yeah. So we've talked about Southampton kind of like breaking it. That one of the times when we talked about breaking the statistical model on this podcast this season was when Southampton played Newcastle, and just looking at them, and they have just totally baffled me in terms of their statistics, because they should be kind of rock bottom of the Premier League according to where I'm getting my statistics from.
Yeah.
Is that the same?
Yeah, no, where I get mine. Yeah, no, I did a thing the other week, an article about Steve Bruce and Newcastle, and just again a bit like they're like the reverse Burnley in a sense. No. So they were like this, they're similar to Burnley a few years ago, except on a kind of reduced scale, in the sense that, both on chance quality created and chance quality conceded, Newcastle are the worst team in the league. I saw someone tweet at the weekend actually that Norwich and Newcastle are essentially the wrong way around, and that given the way Norwich have played this season, they should sort of be around where Newcastle are, and vice versa. And that, football obviously isn't that simple, but there is a kind of grain of truth to that. And it's a weird one with Newcastle, because obviously, the club is very divided, and fans, obviously want a new ownership regime, and most of the fans loved Rafa Benitez. But then you've got the flip side, is that Steve Bruce obviously got a lot of supporters in the media as well. So I think he's had a fairly easy ride from the media, but not from the fans, whereas Benitez felt like it was the other way around. But if you remember, Newcastle had a really bad start to the last season, but basically from about January onwards, they were, in terms of kind of chance quality and stuff, they were kind of par for the second half of the season, which for the quality of their squad was an incredible achievement, really. And I think they possibly will stay up this season, but I mean they looked pretty abject against Arsenal at the weekend, and it's one of those ones where managers will often get kind of sacked or whatever when they possibly shouldn't be done. I remember Gary Monk at Swansea had a little bad spell, but the numbers weren't that bad, but he got sacked. But it feels like Steve Bruce is very much the reverse, in that he's kind of been very lucky this season. And, as I said earlier, luck is a massive part of football, but, luck doesn't last forever.
Okay. So another thing I want to pick up on, because I noticed you did an article for the BBC recently, and you mentioned how you thought that the 2020s might spell the end of the big six clubs. Also, the other sentence I read in this is that only outsiders to break into the top six both came in 2015-16. Leicester as champions and Southampton, who came sixth under Ronald Koeman. Are we really the only two teams that have managed to break in the top six in this decade?
Based on it wasn't the entire decade. It was based on my kind of I kind of said the big six era started in 2013-14 or whenever Spurs became not bad. When Pochettino went to Spurs.
Yeah.
In that period it's just Leicester and you guys. So, but yeah, I mean the piece was obviously partly around remembering how bad the Big Four era was in the 2000s. So if we kind of say the 2000s were the Big Four era and the 2010s were the Big Six era, I think for all the problems with modern football and the wealth disparity and everything, I think you'd be hard pressed to argue the 2010s weren't more entertaining than the 2000s. And there's obviously various reasons for that, but yeah, I think Leicester winning the league in 2016 has kind of changed things quite a lot, in the sense that we've seen Leicester essentially become a legitimate kind of top four, top six team now. And I think it is a bit strange at the moment, because I think the next TV deal could change it a little bit, because obviously, you get Leicester's, Southampton's, Aston Villa's, Everton's, who can outbid and outpay, nominal European giants like, Inter and AC Milan and whoever. But, that might not go on forever. But at the moment, people talk about, is this a bad Premier League? But look at the way that Arsenal and Chelsea weren't particularly impressive last season. Yet every time they went into the Europa League, they kind of just cruised past most teams and got to the final. I do think the general quality of the Premier League at the moment is a lot higher than the other sort of big leagues. So yeah,
I tend to agree with you there, and I also think it's actually quite a lot higher than perhaps even in past seasons. Certainly when I watch Southampton, I suppose I've been watching at that kind of level for quite a long time now, probably since the mid-90s. And the way that we play football as a kind of fairly average top division side is pretty exciting and scintillating. And I don't think we come across many bad teams in our opponents really ever. And you mentioned Norwich there before. I think they're a really good footballing team and would do well in many past divisions. So this is one of the things that I was thinking about this season at the start of the season, is that it was going to be a really hard season, just because there's so many teams that are now what I would consider good. I don't think there's any teams that are dreadful. There's one team which is incredible, but then I think kind of, there's quite a narrow field then between perhaps Liverpool and Man City, and then the whole rest of the division all seem much closer. Certainly when I watch the games, I feel like anyone can beat anyone, in that kind of dreadful old-fashioned phrase, but it actually feels like that is the case.
Yeah, we've only got 15 points between Chelsea in fourth and Bournemouth in 16th, and Villa are only a point behind them. So, and I look at the Premier League this season, and Norwich, really good to watch, like you said. I mean, I think the best game I saw last season was Leeds-Norwich at Ellen Road, which was an incredible match. Watford, quite an interesting team. West Ham, obviously a bit calamitous, but amusing. Villa have been really good. Jack Grealish, possibly the most impressive player, pound for pound, in the Premier League this season. He's, again, another aspect of the sequence model that I talked about, is we can actually track carries now. So traditionally kind of dribbles on the Opta definition has been the number of people you've gone past with the ball. So, if you dribble past three 3 players, you get 3 dribbles essentially. But we can now measure distance that players have carried the ball, so from X to Y. And Grealish is miles clear of everyone, even Adama Traore. So, it shows how vital he is to Villa. Probably only Newcastle and Palace who have been, under, not only kind of struggling, but also just a bit negative this season. But other than that, obviously Sheffield United have come in and been amazing. Wolves have been good. Everton have massively improved under Ancelotti. It's a strange season because of Liverpool's ridiculous lead, but it's also, there's not any games this season where you think, oh, that's not very good. Like there were a few kind of Huddersfield games last season where you're like, that's just going to be pretty grim fare. But, even Southampton Burnley at the weekend, it was like, well, that'd be quite good. Because, 2 teams with distinct approaches and some, some good players. So.
Yeah. And I suppose another question, if we're looking at the whole broad kind of spectre of the Premier League, the Saints Liverpool game where we lost 4-0, it really felt like we were better than Liverpool for most of the first half. The start of the second half we weren't looking too bad, and then you kind of come away from a 4-0 victory and you're kind of scratching your head on, well, how did that happen? And again, it was like the same with the Liverpool-Norwich games. I was with friends who supported Liverpool and Norwich at the weekend. And you're kind of seeing that happen again, Liverpool getting a late-ish victory. Obviously there's one statistic which is absolutely incredible, which is the amount of wins they've had this season. But lots of people keep on saying, oh, well, Manchester City have been quite good. Is this kind of like one of those sort of grey areas where you just can't tell with statistics? Because when you watch Liverpool, they always feel dangerous, even when they're not playing particularly well. And I think this season you've watched Man City a few times, they've always felt like a little bit more fragile, a little bit more...
Yeah, well, I think the difference is, like, if you look at something like expected goals, City are ahead of Liverpool. They've created better chances this season, but what they've tended to do is go mad in a few games, like they beat Watford 8-0 and stuff. They'll just destroy teams, but then they'll also be a lot more susceptible at the back. And I think that is the big difference, is that Liverpool have almost they've solved defending in a sense. I kind of joked a few months ago, last month, about how in one season Liverpool could equal Arsenal's unbeaten record, beat City's 100-point season, and equal Manchester United's treble season all in one campaign. And then I sort of joked, but the one record they won't beat is Chelsea's 15 goals conceded in 04-05. But they've let in 15, and they don't seem to be letting in any more goals. Obviously, I'm pretty sure they will let in at least one more goal before the end of the season. But that is a difference. City have let in we're 1 goal away from letting in twice as many goals as Liverpool this season.
Yeah.
I think the other thing with Liverpool is they basically, there's no way to defend against them, because if you block off the fullbacks, that leaves space for the front three, and vice versa. So, they're very adaptive. And I think they've got, people talk about their midfield, but I think the contributions of people like Ronaldo, Fabinho and Henderson have been underestimated for quite a long time. I think they're possibly getting more focus this season, particularly maybe Henderson. But I think they do a really important job of kind of winning the ball back and covering for other positions. I guess this season is the kind of the icing on the cake of all the work that's gone into building that team.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. So Duncan, I've had you on for quite a while now. I don't want to keep you for too much longer, but there's another thing which I wanted to ask you about, is Danny Ings and the potential for Euro 2020 call-up for England. There's a few English strikers that seem to be out. Danny Ings, England, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd be well up for it. If Ricky Lambert can go to the 2014 World Cup, then there's no reason that Ings can't go to the Euros. And like you say, there's not. Vardy's retired. Kane. it's going to be a nightmare if he gets fit in kind of late May, because they'll pick him and he's not going to be fit, is he? So, and also I think, if maybe a year ago, 6 months ago, it would have sounded outlandish, but if you actually look at the way Ings plays, I think he'd actually suit the England team quite well. We've had Kane in the last year or so kind of dropping deeper and allowing the likes of Sterling and Sancho and whoever to push on. And Ings, in terms of his pressing and his work rate and his kind of overall kind of teamwork, I think would fit in quite well. I mean, the big counter to that is that there's only 2 England games before the squad's announced. So there's not much room for experimentation. But he's surely got to be in the squad, and I can't really see many other options, for Southgate to try. So yeah, I mean, I think I would say he's almost certain to get into the squad now, barring injury. And then it's kind of up to him as to how, whether he can kind of actually carve out a position. But it'd be an amazing story if he does, given all the problems he's had earlier in his career.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed. I mean, I kind of almost hope that Danny Ings just continues this form to the end of the season, but doesn't get much of a run up for England, and then suddenly it all happens for him in the summer, because I don't want him to get injured on any of the international breaks that we have between now and the end of the season. But
yeah,
who knows? Who knows what will happen? Danny Ings scoring their winner for the Euro 2020s in Wembley sounds pretty good to me. So we'll keep our fingers crossed for that. Duncan, before you go, I think you and I both share a love for cycling as well.
Yes.
How do you manage this? So, I always think with football, when I started doing this podcast, there was a bit of a danger that when I was going to Southampton matches, I was looking too much at what was happening in the game and not actually enjoying the experience as a fan so much. I guess you probably get that with football. Is cycling somewhere where you can just totally let go and just watch it and not feel like you're at work? Or do you then suddenly get obsessed by all the statistics around cycling? How many watts?
A little bit. A little bit. I mean, the thing I like about cycling in some respects is you can, it's a cliche about cycling, but you can go and ride the same roads that, I've cycled up Alpe d'Huez and various other Ventoux and various other ones as well. So that's pretty cool. I mean, I know you can technically play at St Mary's or Wembley or whatever, but it's a lot harder to do. But also, for me, it is the kind of, I have it as a sport, a bit like I had football when I was a kid, in the sense of, I just kind of watch it for its, for enjoyment. And there's people I follow on Twitter who kind of probably do similar things to what I do for football. And I kind of, enjoy their content about cycling without the need to kind of, get involved myself very often, at least. So, I just kind of like there's a kind of certain darkness and kind of Euro-ness to cycling that I've always really loved. The kind of, just sort of event, like, I don't know if you've been to something like the Tour of Flanders or Paris-Roubaix, but just this kind of, it's the most kind of Euro thing you can ever go to. Just sort of, gruff Belgians just stood in the rain and just journeyman pros with scars everywhere. Cycling's become, I think in the UK, it's because of its popularity in recent years, it's become a bit of a kind of like a middle class sort of thing. But in Europe, Western Europe, Belgium, Holland, it's very much a kind of working man's thing. And there is a real, I mean, I think I would maintain there's a semi-classic race, end of February. I can't remember what it was called, actually. It's a really minor one, but basically during the Beast from the East a couple of years ago, Philippe Gilbert won it. It was like -10 and he wasn't wearing gloves. And I maintain it's the hardest thing I've ever seen any sportsman do. It's like, I don't know how he did it, but it's just this kind of like rawness that I love. And so, and it also, if you go beyond, obviously a lot of people watch the Tour de France in the summer, but some of the kind of early season or late season events, I love kind of niche stuff, and that is going pretty niche. So that's good.
So for the non-cycling inclined, what race would you encourage someone to watch this spring then to get into cycling?
So there's a thing in cycling called the Spring Classic, which is basically like a load of one-day races between March and the end of April. Possibly the best. You've basically got a week where you've got the Tour of Flanders in Belgium one Sunday, then the following Sunday got Paris-Roubaix, and probably Paris-Roubaix is the best one to watch. It's kind of the way I've always described it to people who aren't into cycling is it's almost around the same weekend often, but it's like the Grand National, but instead of horses, it's men on bikes, and it's basically over all the cobbled roads in northern France, and it's just carnage and crashes, and it's kind of like the Hunger Games. You start off with 200 riders, and maybe 50 of them, if that, make it to this bleak velodrome in Roubaix, which is one of the most kind of run-down towns in northern France. And I did the amateur version last year, actually.
Did you? Bloody hell.
Yeah, which is the day before the actual pro race. And yeah, it's definitely some of those cobbled roads. There's a famous one called the Arenberg, and it was, I'd read stuff about, it's ridiculously hard. And it was like, it went from smooth tarmac to what felt like the start of Saving Private Ryan within about 2 seconds. And people were just flying off into verge, and there was a guy in front of me, I heard his collarbone snap, and the bike's braking. It was just like, and I looked back afterwards on Strava or whatever, and it had taken me, I don't know, 4 minutes 50 or something to do this stretch of cobbles. And to me, it could have been, it's considered 10 seconds or 2 hours. I wouldn't have been able to argue because, yes, time both sped up and slowed down. So, yeah, that race is particularly good, I'd say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, big recommendation there. There's actually a chap from the cycling club I used to ride with when I lived in London. He's now in Team Sky, Theo Geoghegan-Hart, who I actually think could be quite a good shout for a spring classic. Maybe not this year. I think he needs to harden up a bit, get a little bit older, a little bit more wily. But I think
he started the season pretty well. So yeah.
Yeah, I've got to say, the one time I went riding with him, it was utterly brutal. We went out at an incredible speed, stopped at the cafe. He went and did like an extra loop of about 30 odd miles, and then overtook everyone in the cycling club on the way back, having done the extra on the way back into London. And that was just a gentle ride for him. It's a totally different level, isn't it?
I mean, it's the same. I mean, I've played five-side football with some ex-pros as well. Like, no matter the sport, really, just that. It's when you realise the difference in quality between, an amateur and a professional is pretty. It can be pretty soul destroying when you. I've cycled with out of shape ex pros, and they're still really good. So
yeah. All right, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Duncan. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. If people want to hear more from you, I presume they should tune into the Totally Football Show with James Richardson, but they can also find you on Twitter at Oily Sailor.
Yeah.
And
correct.
if they want to take a statistical journey through the history of football, they can pick up your book at any good bookstore.
Indeed, yeah.
Well, brilliant. Thank you very much, Duncan. And
thank you.
Do let us know, listeners, what you thought of the episode. Saintsfcpodcast at gmail.com or at Saintsfcpodcast on Twitter. We'll see you next time.